for Duke Watson. And you were going to back up just a little bit and tell me an important
Yes.
preface.
Prior to Mount Belvedere, and in fact, prior to the big start of the campaign of the final drive through the Apennines, all of our troops were getting conditioned to being in the line and under German surveillance. And one of the assignments that kept getting rotated a company at a time was to occupy a little remote village right under Mount Belvedere called Corciola. And it was an abandoned village, very quaint. It had a chapel with a nice organ in it and so on, but the place was totally abandoned. And we relieved another company. The reliefs were all done by a long march at night because we didn't want to allow, during the day we were completely out of sight because we were under full German visibility, that is, in occupying Corciola. But my company spent about 5-6 days, I guess, and nights occupying Corciola. It was quite an experience, but finally it was our time to get relieved. And that was a busy time because we had to wait for the relieving unit that couldn't start, had to march quite a few miles to get into Corciola and then gradually occupy at night, get acquainted with the area, and various sentry posts had to be manned with the personnel exchanging. It all took a lot of time. And then once the relieving unit would come in, then we had to start pulling out, and we had to get out of there and hike out with our full equipment and over a ridge into defilade where trucks would wait for us. So that was a long night, a very busy one for me. And I remember marching out as dawn was about to break, and we still had a mile or more to go. And I was at the rear of my company, sort of patrolling for stragglers, and they were having a hard time. There was one poor chap that was really struggling with his pack. He was a small guy, and I said, you've got to pick up the pace. I'm going to relieve you of some of your pack here, because I wasn't carrying as much as an officer. And I said, what on earth do you have in this pack? And he was sort of embarrassed and didn't say anything. I looked in it, and he had several sections of brass organ pipe that must have weighed 30 pounds. And I gave him a quick lecture, threw the pipes out, and sent him on his way. But anyway, we got out just in time before dawn broke. And we went back into a relieving area, which I know the name full well, but I can't think of it. But here we were going to have a relaxed time for, we didn't know how long, several days anyway. And there was much to look forward to. So that evening, after we were all quartered, I was sitting around with my lieutenants, and all of a sudden, this flash came to me. During the relief, lo and behold, out of the blue, out of the dark, had come a finance officer from 4 Corps, which is our division was a part of, with the payroll for my company. And I said, why do you have to deliver it up here? Well, he said, we've got to deliver it wherever you are, but here it is. So it was in big packages that were put on my little desk that had been erected in this company headquarters. So that was that, and then I went on about all of my responsibility, got out of there, and as I was sitting around in the early evening, it dawned on me that payroll was back there. The next morning, those men were looking forward to getting their monthly pay, and they weren't going to get it if I didn't do something about it. Well, all of my lieutenants volunteered to go, and I said, no, this is my responsibility. I think I better go. So I commandeered a Jeep from the motor pool and took off with a corporal who was a Jeep driver. It was a long, lonely drive up there, and we got to the far point where we had met our trucks on the way out. And I said, now, I don't know how long I'll be gone, but you'll be safe enough here. It's going to be a long wait. But he said, sir, I'd rather go with you if you don't mind. I said, well, all right, if you want to do it, come with me. So the two of us marched in there, and it was a long, eerie journey with the moonlight shining, as I remember, and searchlights playing all over the place from who knew where. And as we approached Corciola, it was with trepidation because I was afraid some trigger-happy sentinel might open up on us. But presently I got a call from a sentry and gave involved password and code that identified me, and we were admitted. And so I came back to this little company headquarters, and there was the relieving company commander, whose name I forget now. He was from the 87th, and he said, I thought you might be back. He said, if you didn't return, if you didn't come back during the night, I was going to give my company double pay tomorrow morning. So I grabbed the package and we ran with it, got out of there. Well, going back, now we felt mission accomplished and we were more relaxed. And we were about halfway back when we were going along the road, which, as it were, there'd been some vehicle travel over it, and there was no snow on the road, but on the woods to either side, there was crunchy snow, and suddenly we detected the crunch of snow off to our right, and we knew somebody was traveling through there. So we were unarmed, taking no chances. I beckoned to the corporal to follow me, and we sneaked off into a gully that was covered with brush, and picked our way through snow until we got what we thought was out of earshot, and just in time we got crouched down, probably not more than 50 feet away, and here came two German scouts across this road, and they just looked up and down the road and then went on. They couldn't see any footprints from us because the road was bare, and they didn't observe where we'd gone in the brush. And presently they signaled, and then here came maybe a dozen men. It was not a combat patrol, it was a reconnaissance patrol from the size of it. And they were probably from Mount Belvedere and were just making a loop around Querciola to see what they could see. And of course, the tragedy would have been if we'd been detected, we'd either been dead ducks or we'd have been PWs, and I would never have lived that infamy down because my battalion commander didn't know where I was and my regimental commander didn't know where I was. So we waited a full 10 minutes after they'd crossed the road and gone on, and then silently got out and headed on out with no further incident. But immediately when we got out there, I said, we're not going back yet, we're going up to Viciatico, where I knew there was a Corps intelligence unit, and I wanted to report the activity to him. So we got up there in the dead of night, of course, and it was practically a ghost town, but I knew where I'd been to that Corps intelligence unit before, so I went to it, aroused a colonel, who then I reported what had happened, and he grilled us intensively for several minutes, and then he said, well, we'll handle this. He said, this is valuable information, knowing that they are patrolling around Querciola. But he said, I want no mention of this to anyone, any of your superiors or inferiors. Repeat, no mention. And he was particularly intensive to the corporal about it, but we both assured him Mum was the word, and so that was that. And, all went well. I got back there and distributed the pay the next morning. And none was ever the worse for wear. I never saw the driver again, so I hope he kept his mouth shut. But after the war, I was fully ambulatory, and this Captain Bailey, who I mentioned to you earlier, Abbie, came thoughtfully down to my hospital from the front. He was getting a few days of leave and picked me up with the permission of my ward surgeon, who we headed south to Rome and had several delightful days there with Colonel Works and Colonel Irwin from division headquarters. Irwin was the G2 of the division, and or G3, and Works was the G2, the intelligence officer. So I told Works this story, and he said, "Oh yes," he said, "Corps relayed that information to me, and I passed it on to your battalion intelligence officer, Dave Felser." So that was that. But that was my first taste of first-hand experience with any of the enemy, although it was more of a spooky thing than anything combat related. Going on from there, though, and back to closer to combat, we finally got the assignment that our battalion was to assigned to take the summit of Mount della Torraccia. We had a day that the battalion commander, some of his staff, and we four company commanders went up with some assistance, just a few hand-picked individuals from each company, to survey the ground from where we were going to be launching the attack. And it was wooded, and there'd been a company from Colonel Stone's battalion of the 85th that had tried to take Della Torraccia, and had not succeeded. And then they'd occupied foxholes in the woods that night, which was a terrible mistake, because the German artillery would just fire and hit the trees and explode downward into the foxholes, and they had sustained a high amount of casualty. It was a real tragedy, and poor Colonel Stone got, I think that must have ruined his Army career. He was sent back to some rear area for further assignment. But that was the outfit we were to replace, so we got a pretty good impression looking from the secluded timber up at the summit we were to head for. So Major Hay, our battalion commander, who later on became a 3-star general, gave his orders, and my company was selected to lead the attack, and K Company was going to be in reserve with L Company supporting us, I guess. So the jump off was going to be at 0700 in the morning, which was shortly after daybreak, and because this was late February, and the days were getting a little longer. Of course, it was a rather fitful night. I gave the orders to my platoon leaders, so everybody was prepared, but this was going to be our first big intensive combat, and we knew it would be a tough fight. Prior to probably beginning about 6:15, all hell broke loose, and our corps artillery was pounding the German troops up on della Torraccia to the point where none of us could believe anybody could survive it. But it's amazing what men in foxholes can do with artillery shell fragments flying all around them. They had the advantage up there because there were no trees, so there was no air bursts of artillery at all. Happened when the artillery hit the ground, and thus the shell fragments, for the most part, wouldn't get into foxholes. So there were a lot of men that survived up there of that terrific pounding. We also had a few aircraft zipping over and dropping things like napalm bombs, which were awful, nasty affairs that the Germans were in mortal fear of. But anyway, after about 45 minutes of this, the fire ceased, and they'd had a rolling barrage that had gone forward, starting on the near slopes of della Torraccia and going on beyond it and over on the backside. So 7 o'clock came, I gave the order to jump off, and off we went. And my 3rd platoon was leading the attack under Lieutenant Wilde, and then I had another platoon, the 2nd platoon, on his flank, and the idea was to hit the ridge as soon as we could. All went well. It was there was a lot of heavy fire, and casualties began to pop up here and there. I was advancing with the 1st platoon and had succeeded in getting up on the ridge right at the summit. But there was a good observation point a bit off to the left. And on the way up, my artillery forward observer had been fatally wounded. I have to explain that every infantry rifle company had a artillery lieutenant attached as a forward observer that could accompany the company and relay back by radio artillery fire, supporting fire. Well, I'd lost my artillery forward observer, so I had taken his radio, and my own radio operator and messenger knew how to operate it. And I can't remember what had happened to his radio man. He was either wounded or killed also. But anyway, we had this artillery radio, got to this OP, or observation point, and began to direct fire. The artillery radio mast was taller than our infantry radio masts, and the Germans probably spotted that soon. And presently there was a round that came in from one of their 170 howitzers over us, and then another one came in short of us. With that, I said to my radio man, "We've got to get out of here." I no sooner said it than whomp, this round came in right on top of us, and my only sensation was I felt like I just was picked up and slammed down to the ground, and the concussion was such both of us got the wind knocked out of us. But when we regained breathing, I realized I'd been hit. I was perforated, it felt like in the tummy. I could feel something over my left hip. And I asked my radio operator how he was, and he said, "I'm unscratched." And I said, "Well, you get back as fast as you can with that radio, get into defilade, and I'll be following you." So I worked my way back, crawling now, or creeping would be the better word. In military parlance, crawling is snaking along on your tummy, creeping his hands and knees. So I crept back to a slit trench, which wasn't too far away, and it was a German slit trench, but I got into that, which was some protection, and lay there for a few minutes with all hell going on all around me. But I was able to then recoup. My radio man came over and joined me, and I was able to call back, talk to my battalion commander, report that we had occupied the summit, and that my executive officer, the second in command, had come forward and was taking over the company.
Do you recall who your radio man was?
Yes, I do, and it was quite interesting because I did meet him afterward, and I'll tell you that in a sequel. His name is Bob Comer, C-O-M-E-R, and there's a rather dramatic story about him. I'll come to you a little later, but Lieutenant Bennett, my second in command, came forward, took over command, and we were installed on the summit, and I felt very, actually, I felt it was the second biggest moment of my life, my first being when Marilyn accepted my proposal to her. But second only to that was, aside from being born, I guess, was leading the battalion to the division final objective for that phase of the Apennine campaign. And so at least I got up there and got the company planted. And then I figured that I didn't know quite what the condition was, but I knew I had a belly full of shell fragments, and I could visualize now I can't think of the word for infection of the intestines, but that infection would soon set in, and that my best bet was to not wait around for some aid man, maybe for 11 or 12 hours. So I thought I'd try to get back under my own power. So I began to creep, I guess, on hands and knees, and I thought, well, this is never going to get me anywhere. I'll see if I'm able to walk. So I stood up and felt okay. I was weak, but I was strong enough that I could walk, and commenced to walk. I walked back through K Company, who was now being committed as our reserve company, and some of their group were sort of appalled because I had a very bloody shirt and so on, was bleeding rather profusely. But I made my way back and then had to go up a minor hill to get over a ridge to get in defilade where our battalion headquarters was. And there would be, I knew, waiting mules with stretchers. Was that you?
I'm not sure it was. Everything's okay now.
All right, I'll continue then. And so I started up this grade. It wasn't a steep hill, but it was fairly good incline. And the German artillery was really coming in. And my old friend Ralph Bromaghan, who was the company commander of headquarters company, observed me coming up, and he saw me kind of staggering. So he came charging out. He's a big man. He was about 6'5", and by then I was getting pretty weak, and he picked me up over his shoulder and marched me back up over the hill, got me onto a stretcher on a mule, and there was another guy on the stretcher on the other side. I never knew who it was. And down the mountain we went via mule. It was quite gentle. And we got down to our battalion aid station where our young battalion medic, he was fresh out of internship, diagnosed me, and turned out he diagnosed me quite well. Let me take a little drink of water and gave me a shot of morphine. Then I was put on a Jeep, and that was a tough ride, even with that morphine. That was a real pounder. But I at least got back to our station hospital at Porretta Terme. Interesting thing about Porretta Terme was that that was well within the German field of fire, but we had sent the coordinates of that hospital to the Germans, and they respected it very well. And we could, well, I spent about close to 2 weeks in that station hospital, or that field hospital. No, closer to a week. I'm wrong about that, about a week. And there was pounding, especially at night, all around us, but never anywhere really close to the hospital. they respected, and I think this was common practice throughout the Western Front. Of course, over in Asia that would not have happened, but despite all the nastiness of Nazism, the German high command of their service fought war sort of in a gentlemanly way, and they really respected hospitals, I think.
I want to ask you a couple general questions about being in the 10th Mountain Division, a little more philosophical. What does it mean to you to have been a part of the 10th Mountain Division?
It means a tremendous amount. I have to say that probably the most satisfying experience of my life, other than my relationship, a beautiful relationship with my wife, was my time in the 10th Mountain Division. I felt, in a way, this is a little bit hackneyed to say, but to give that much to your country at an important time, I think most of us just felt that way, that we'll never do anything later in life that will be this meaningful. And I can look back on my long, fortunate life and say the same thing. I've led a wonderful, happy life, but nothing can compare with that experience.
What sort of legacy do you think the 10th Mountain Division leaves?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, Abbie. I may be overly reacting too much in this direction, but for as closely attached as I am to it, I was so proud of it and being part of it. But I think because of the uniqueness of their role, they've become much more in the limelight with the general public than all these other, maybe more deserving divisions that fought far greater. I think our combat in the Apennines was pretty intense, and I don't think many infantry divisions had anything any more severe than this. It's hard to say, but the intensity there on della Torraccia and some of the follow-ups was as severe as I think most infantry encounters were. The fields of fire were tremendous. And the artillery was so prominent. One thing we did not have, which the Western Front had some of earlier on, was German aircraft. We were in complete control of the air, which meant a tremendous amount, because with strafing aircraft and dropping bombs, it would have been a whole nother scene. So we were very fortunate there. But it was incredibly intense fire. But getting back to your question, there were other divisions, and I'm thinking of the 3rd Division particularly, which I had been briefly a part of in this company commanded by Paul Lafferty, and John Woodward had come from it, and a number of us had. And that was a regular Army division. It was, at the time of Pearl Harbor, only one of 2 U.S. divisions that was anywhere near full strength, the 2nd and the 3rd. The 2nd was at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and the 3rd was at Fort Lewis. And the 3rd didn't get moved out right away. We thought we'd be caught up in it and be headed out to the Pacific or something, but that did not happen. We went on into the 87th Mountain Infantry and sort of lost track of the 3rd Division, but it popped up in North Africa. It was our first unit to go over there. Then from North Africa, where it fought admirably, it crossed Sicily, heavy fighting there, and then all the way up the Italian boot. And the 3rd Division was second to none, and they were given tough assignment after tough assignment. And not only the 3rd, but the other divisions there, so many of them just in Italy, to say nothing of the Western Front, had these heavy poundings. And the 3rd, shortly before we got there, was moved around to Omer Bradley's command on the Western Front, and they fought the last part of the war over there. And their casualty rate was 3 times the strength of the division. That was, I'm not talking about fatalities, but total casualties was over 45,000 men, where ours was, well, we lost about just short of 1,000 men, probably maybe 5,000 total casualties, but couldn't compare with something like the 3rd. Anyway, I think in a way it's too bad that the 10th gets all this notoriety, but nevertheless, I'm delighted with it in another way and proud of it.
How do you think the active 10th Mountain Division embodies the spirit of the original 10th Mountain Division?
Well, I'm a poor person to answer that because I've been so inactive of recent years. But I think that from all I discern and the little glimpses I've had when I have partaken, the spirit is certainly there. I went to one 10th reunion. It was kind of a mini reunion. It was at Sun Valley, Idaho, but it was at Sun Valley's 50th anniversary. And that was the main celebration. But when the 10th realized that there was going to be this gala celebration, which lasted the better part of a week at Sun Valley, it was decided in an impromptu way to have a 10th Mountain gathering there too. So Ralph Lafferty from Eugene, Oregon, an old friend from the 10th, got hold of us. He had a place at Sun Valley. He said, please join us and spend the time over there with us. We got a good digs to stay in, and he had a nice cottage there near the base of the north side of Sun Valley. I won't go into that. I can't think of the name right now. In any event, we went, and I thoroughly enjoyed the time. I was very happy that I went because I was able to reunite with some old friends, Percy Rideout, John Litchfield, along with John Woodward, and any number of other people who I had known well. We had a great time, and at dinner one night, this was the final night of the big gala banquet, we arrived, there were 6 of us, Woodward and his wife, Marilyn and I, and Lafferty and his wife, and most of the tables were occupied, and we all got kind of separated and looking around, and Marilyn spotted a table where there was just one woman sitting at it, and Marilyn said, is this table occupied? She said, no, please join us, just my husband and I. So she did and signaled the rest of us. We all came over. At that point, her husband came, and we got seated next to each other. And we looked at each other, and he looked familiar to me, and I said, are you Lieutenant Menke? He said, that is I. He said, I ended up as Captain Menke. I said, you probably did a big contribution to saving my life. I was one of your first casualties off of della Torraccia. And he had just written a book that I had, you may have seen his book, and he says in some early part of it, one of his first casualties was one of the 5 company commanders, and he puts in a line, Abbie, you may recall it, I wonder whatever happened to Captain Watson. Well, here we were, side by side. It was a dramatic moment that I'll never forget. But the final answer to your question is, there was certainly sustained spirit there. It just really, it was electrical. And I think probably that happens whenever there's a 10th gathering. Whether it'll continue on.
Well, I actually meant with the 10th Mountain Division serving right now in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, whether you meant them.
Well, I was thinking, do you see any parallels of spirit between the active modern 10th?
I wish I knew. I'm sure some of the tradition has come down to this new unit. And so I'm sure there's a certain amount of pride that they're bearing that famous name. Of course, and they're centered at back here. Their home base is Fort Drum, New York, which is hardly in the mountains. But I think there must be a certain amount of, mainly through tradition, of pride for anybody that joins the modern 10th Division.
What are the lessons that can be learned by the active 10th Mountain Division from the original 10th Mountain Division?
Oh my, what can be learned? Well, the fighting is so different today. I'm not sure quite how to answer that.
How about like mental sort of lessons learned?
Well, if any of the present day 10th acquainted themselves with the history of the 10th in World War II, they have to know that we went through some pretty hard shellacking and lost, for the relatively brief time we were in combat, we took heavy casualties, and yet we came through with flying colors, and I think that has to be an example to the 10th of today, to carry on that spirit. Now, I'm not quite familiar with specifically what the 10th's been doing overseas, but they've been in Afghanistan for over 2 years, I believe, maybe longer than that. They were one of the first units to go over, and now some of them are, as you said, down in Iraq. They are certainly serving their time there, and it must get wearing on some of them, but I would like to think that there's a tradition of the World War II 10th Division that still means something in today's division.
Briefly, is there any other message you would like the world to know about the 10th Mountain Division in the last couple of minutes here?
That I would like to what?
Is there any other message that you would like the world to know about the 10th Mountain Division?
Well, how do I answer that? I think not the world, but certainly a lot of U.S. citizenry already know an amazing amount about the 10th, because so much has been written about it, and then productions such as the wonderful thing you're doing will further perpetuate it. I'm astonished at how much is known about the 10th. So I don't know what further I can say about instilling any knowledge in within the U.S. and its borders anyway. Shall I try to answer that further? Or?
No. Is there anything else you'd like to add at all on any topic?
Well, I was going to tell you, this is a little sequel, but another amazing coincidence, like meeting Lieutenant Menke, was meeting my old radio operator runner, Bob Comer. That was at the one reunion that's been held here in Seattle, which I wasn't going to go to. I thought, oh, that'll be sort of ho-hum. And one of my friends, not a 10th alumnus at all, said, Duke, you've got to get downtown, and have you been down to see have you attended any of your division's meetings? I said, no, I thought I probably wouldn't do it. And I didn't have anything against it, but I couldn't see. I thought, well, I won't know anybody. So he said, well, there's some wonderful panoramic photos that you ought to at least see. So I decided to go down and snoop around, and I did. I came in, saw lots of old geezers, that none of whom I recognized at all. And then my eye was attracted to this panoramic display, and there I saw the Apennine Range. I saw Riva Ridge, Belvedere, over here Della Torraccia. And I went up to closely scrutinize Della Torraccia, and here was a chap standing alongside of me, explaining to his wife, and he said, and it was right about there that Captain Watson and I were when we were hit. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and it was Comer, of all people. It was just hard to believe. He'd been this little 18-year-old radio man, and now he looked as old as I did. Of course, our age difference now wasn't all that much, but it was a dramatic moment. And then he and Vic Eklund, who you met today, was my weapons platoon leader, and the two of them talked me into coming to a little mini reunion our company was going to have at a dinner at the local Swedish club, appropriately. And Vic is a good Swede, I guess. And he's been much more active than I have, and he kind of organized this thing. And I wish I had taken Marilyn. A lot of wives were there, but I did go to that, and it was very heartwarming. And then, ironically, that was in August of a number of years ago. It's been quite a few years ago. But that was in August. I got a call from Vic Eklund on Thanksgiving morning that following fall. Said, I've got some sad news. Bob Comer died yesterday of a heart attack back in Minneapolis, I think, where he lived. And he had come back from the war. And by the way, he had had 3 close calls. He'd been standing a bit later on after my getting wounded. He'd been standing right next to our first sergeant, getting some orders from him, when the first sergeant was shot dead by a sniper. And then he had another third very close encounter, but emerged totally unscathed. And then and he'd come back, gone back to the University of Minnesota, and had become quite a track star, and he became the national 440-yard champion at his time of the National Collegiate Athletic